Welcome to the Werewolf Den, where we delve into gaming concepts behind White Wolf's Werewolf the Apocalypse.
I'm Amelin.
And I'm Ryan. Welcome back to the Werewolf Den, where we are talking about auspices. So last time we talked about breeds, which is the form that you are born into as a werewolf. With auspices, this is a form that you undergo your first change with. So your character still does not have a say in which auspice they get. Oftentimes, this is sort of mythologically determined to be Luna's decision as to what role you will play within society, but that's not strictly canonical. There is a ritual, for example, that allows you to change your auspice after you've been inducted into the nation. So this is something that has some flexibility. It doesn't dictate everything about your character. Now, in terms of understanding auspices, I think that it's helpful to consider it from the perspective of, if you have a king, what will the auspices do to help in the management of the kingdom? So the Ragabash is useful to think of from sort of a Shakespearean perspective. This is the fool within the kingdom. The Ragabash is going to get people to look at things from a different perspective, to analyze a situation from, a unique idea outside the box, that sort of thing. This doesn't mean that people respect that opinion, and this can cause Ragabash some problems, but we'll get into that in a bit more detail later on. The Theurge, the second auspice, is the spiritual advisor. They're the ones who have the best access to the Umbra and to the spirit world. And so that is their role within the kingdom, sort of understanding the mythic and the magical from a spiritual angle. The Philodox is well situated between these extremes. And so they're often considered to be sort of the mediators, the arbiters, and the judges. They're the ones who typically have very clear thinking in terms of understanding all of these different perspectives. Their rage is right at the middle ground for starting. And so this helps to sort of cement their position as these mediators and arbiters. So legal matters, punishments, these sorts of things are their milieu. The Galliard is the cultural advisor. The Garou nation is a very oral society, and so the Galliards are the ones who learn the stories and tell them and can sort of shape the culture of this society based on their perspectives. Lastly, the Ahroun are the militant ones. These are the military advisors, typically associated with combat, but not specifically. But that is their role to sort of determine when and how to fight the enemy. So we'll begin to look into each one specifically in a deep dive. Now that you understand the basics and the broad, we'll look at the specific.
And of course, we'll start with everybody's favorite fool, the New Moons, the Ragabash. Now, there's a couple of different ways that you can definitely approach Ragabash, but the most common methods are, first and foremost, what is more of the White Wolf interpretive or inspirational method, which is to look at the inspirational deities that White Wolf drew from when they were conjuring up the Ragabash. Think of these trickster deities like Coyote, Loki, Anansi. They are what you kind of want to think of. And one of the big key aspects of this is these are prankster gods. There's various stories about these particular gods going around and playing tricks on unsuspecting mortals. The big thing, though, that people always kind of misconstrue when they think prankster god or trickster is this notion of just somebody who is just random or very much kind of memey or very scattered for the most part. These are kind of the things where we start to kind of run into problems most frequently with the Ragabash, in my opinion, where you get somebody who's running around, they're pissing off their storytellers and their fellow players by playing these random tricks on them, but there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to them. And the big thing to always kind of consider is the Ragabash is meant to have this kind of contrarian, almost
Rebellious,
thank you. These pranks need to have a reason for them. When you think about things like, you don't want to, per se, go around and prank your alpha just because, it's been way too long since you pranked them. What you want to do is you want to prank your alpha because your alpha has been perhaps maybe obsessing a little too much about this particular person that they think is a Fomori. They have no real proof yet, and there's bigger things to worry about out there. But they're really fixated on this particular Fomori. And so a good Ragabash is going to come up with a little trick to be like, hey, that Fomori, they're important. Trust me, they're really important. That Fomori, they're in that building over there. And just let your alpha spend like an entire evening just raging into this empty space until they eventually just get all the energy out and realize, I wasted my time. I have been wasting my pack's time.
Yeah, there's got to be a method to the madness here. A lot of the gifts of the Ragabash are oftentimes associated with sort of your rogues in D&D. There's a lot of infiltration and espionage that they can conduct, and people tend to take this to misconstrue the purpose of the Ragabash. That they are not your, B&E experts. They're not there to pick the locks and disarm the traps. These gifts, these abilities, allow them places to learn more and to set up these lessons. So, if there's a businessman who's corrupt and schemy and, definitely has his hands dirtied, then the Ragabash can use these gifts of infiltration to get in, get proof of their deeds, and perhaps blackmail them into doing better, or releasing it to the media so that way they are slandered and lose influence in society. So yeah, there are a lot of different ways to approach the Ragabash. You can do it from, taking inspiration from these mythical deities, like Amelin mentioned, or you can also, you don't have to be a prankster. Again, you can take as much or as little from the auspice as you please.
But yeah, I think that pretty much covers Ragabash pretty thoroughly for the most part. Mm-hmm. So let's move on to one of your favorites to talk about, Theurge.
So, Theurge, like we mentioned, is the spiritual advisor. And in terms of dealing with the Umbra, which is, the spiritual reflection of the material world in the setting of Werewolf the Apocalypse, the Theurge is the one most apt in that environment. Their gifts and their special powers really enable them to operate within this sphere. While we're on that point, I think it's important to mention that none of these auspices sort of dominate or monopolize, I think is a better word. None of them monopolize this aspect. You can be of any auspice and try and, be a rabble-rouser and a rebel and get people to think outside the box. Any auspice can operate within the Umbra, but there are limitations that will inhibit them. The Theurge breaks down those limitations. One of their keynote gifts is called Spirit Speech, which allows them to communicate with any spirit regardless of linguistic or even communicative barriers. So any auspice can wander into the Umbra and talk to a spirit of security that manifests as like a police officer or a constabulary figure. If they speak a human language, then you can communicate with that spirit. But if I'm trying to talk to the spirit of a rock I found, no human language is going to be able to communicate with that rock. The Theurge is able to.
One of the key aspects that I always try to instill whenever I am running for Theurges is just because you understand doesn't necessarily mean you know. And that's one of those things that I feel is probably the trickiest aspect of being a Theurge. When you run in and play a Theurge, a lot of players will run in and be like, oh, I know the spirits. I know what I'm supposed to do with them. I know how I'm supposed to handle them. And it's like, the Umbra is an incredibly broad and ever-changing place. So one of the things that, per se, when you're dealing with that rock spirit, you need to understand is that rock spirit only understands the world from the perspective of a rock. So, when you're trying to sit there and have some sort of like more in-depth or explain some sort of concept to that spirit that's beyond its milieu, it's going to look at you blankly and continue to be a rock. And it's one of those things that allows so much more creative aspects to it. One of my favorite moments was I was running a scene for a young player who had never played the game, but they were playing a Theurge, and they were wanting to try going through the rite of passage to earn their tribe, which we'll talk about in later episodes. But the player was having a difficulty figuring out what to do, how to handle these things. All of these big spirits are throwing tests at this player, and the player is confused by these tests. And the player's getting frustrated, being like, I don't get what these spirits are trying to communicate to me. They speak either really bizarrely, or they are so hyper-focused on something that I can't reason with them, and I don't understand this. To which then, that player had an idea, and they're like, I am going to sit and meditate until the sunrise. And at that point, somewhere around me, there will be a spirit of the dawn. And that dawn is going to bring new light, new enlightenment to me. And that is an excellent way to kind of think of how to handle being a Theurge. Spirits are weird and cryptic, but they're also beautifully diverse and metaphorical. And that's what you really want to play with, are the metaphors behind those spirits when you're a Theurge. You don't need to understand every possible metaphor that your storyteller throws at you, because you're just going to be frustrated. That's all that's going to happen. But you can sit there and try to comprehend and think in metaphors yourself. And that will really help, I think, with a Theurge.
In terms of roleplay, you can come to the Theurge with a lot of different directions, just like with all the others. So a lot of people go with the more neo-pagan or animistic mysticism and approach it from that direction, which is fine, but, you know, when 90% of the player base is doing it, it sort of loses some of its spark. So remember, you can approach this from all different directions. You can come at this from the entire gamut of human spirituality and approach it in that sense. You could also address it from sort of an atheistic perspective, or look at it in a very scientific method. So when you are doing your rituals, everything is measured out properly, you understand the components and how they balance together, and you look at the Umbra from a more scientific rather than mystical avenue. So there is a lot of different ways that you can roleplay the Theurge. It's not all, you know, vanilla cookie cutter. Moving on, we have the Philodox.
The Philodox is definitely one of those where you definitely see a dynamic shift between the Philodox with LARP and tabletop. And it has to do with that mediator-judge aspect that we talked about, well, that you talked about earlier. Mm-hmm. One of the best Philodoxes that I've ever seen played was a moment, again, it was another rite of passage moment where I collected a bunch of Philodoxes from different tribes and had them debate with each other about philosophy. And those make for excellent roleplay Philodox moments. And those are hard moments to get in a tabletop.
Right. When you're dealing with a smaller pool of players, you have fewer and fewer opportunities to sort of balance everyone's perspective and, you know, create that conversation. In packs where there's a lot of unity, or where you don't have those complex situations to analyze, the Philodox can sort of lose their weight, I think.
One of the best ways, more or less, I've tried to advise players to deal with this if they're in a tabletop setting, is to seek those moments out, or create them yourself. Philodox is described very much as a reactive auspice, to the most part, with the whole mediation and judge. But if you want to have fun playing a Philodox, I feel like the best thing that you can do is play a Philodox that has ambition. Mm-hmm. Play a Philodox that wants to lead. Play a Philodox that wants to be alpha, rather a pack or a set. Play a Philodox that wants a set position. Play a Philodox that wants to have power in human life and is having difficulty struggling with that.
As well, a lot of the Philodox role sort of operates around the laws of the Garou Nation. Again, the Garou Nation is an oral tradition. There is something called the Silver Record, and while White Wolf did, I think, produce a copy of the Silver Record so that you could read it, that's far from being necessary, and it's not, cast in stone. There are sort of the tenets known as the Litany, but those are very sort of broad and open to interpretation. And so the Philodox can definitely thrive in this situation. If there's nothing going on, you can raise an issue about this law and start a debate, start a discussion, and to try and direct, the player group towards having your moral principles in mind when they're looking at these things.
Yeah, a fun Philodox character that I have seen played was somebody who was very much a pot stirrer in this sort of method. He ended up rising to be Sept Alpha, and he held that position throughout the longest time, but he went around and he played this abrasive character which actively stirred pots and actively had people being like, no, I despise your philosophy. I challenge for that. And that creates excellent role play.
Mm-hmm. Next up, we have the Galliard, which is my personal favorite. So the Galliard really thrives within this oral tradition. And oftentimes that's sort of their prescribed role. They're the storytellers, the tale singers, those who record the deeds of others. And I think this is a very important point, because within Werewolf the Apocalypse, there's a system mechanic known as renown. And this sort of determines your station in society, how high or low you are on that totem pole, things of that sort. And it's measured by your deeds.
This makes Galliards have a unique position in any role-playing system. And it is one of the reasons why they're one of the better auspices, in my opinion and in your opinion, is because Galliards have the power to either sink or raise your ship.
Mm-hmm. Not every story has to be good. Not every story has to be true. So you can come forth and tell a licentious story about someone. It can be full of lies, but maybe you have one piece of evidence that you bring to the tale to sort of, play on people's emotions and get them to think that, yeah, that person is a piece of garbage. Or, yeah, they're a coward and they ran from this fight. And so it's great for developing inter-player rivalries that aren't, purely focused on punching the other person in the face until one of you stops breathing. Mm-hmm. It's very, very diverse and colorful in that sense.
And one of the great things with playing a Galliard too is chances are if you're playing a Galliard, you are going to end up being the source of a lot of people's best stories from the game. My two favorite stories about previous games that I have come across both involve Galliards. One is I was playing more or less an NPC kinfolk, and I would go in and whisper kind of nasty things into his ear. And one day he developed a rivalry with this Silverfang. This Silverfang infuriated him to no end. And so I started whispering in his ear, he's a Silverfang. You know what their backgrounds are like, right? You know that if you were to go digging, you would find some dirt. And he did. He went, he found some dirt, and he told a story about this player's heritage that was so awesome that even the player playing the Silverfang, out of character, came up and hugged him afterward. Because it was so spot on hilarious and just hit everyone just right where they needed to that day. It was an excellent story. You don't get as many opportunities to do that with other auspices like you do with Galliard. You don't get an opportunity to touch the entire player base with your skill set, particularly with those large form games.
Another aspect of the Galliard that comes up and kind of has a negative ramification in people's understanding of the auspice is that they're also the ones who sort of inspire everyone else. A lot of their gifts relate to that. And the books oftentimes depict them as being the ones, beating the drums of war, inspiring everyone to greater and greater feats. And this leads a lot of people to consider them from the perspective of D&D, with bards, and everything that goes with that. And I think it's important to sort of distance yourself from that concept. That they do have this role within society, but again, it doesn't dictate your class proficiencies, so to speak. You can approach this from all sorts of different directions. Lastly, in terms of roleplay, I also like to point out that Galliards can tell stories in a lot of different ways. I've seen people who will recite poetry. I've seen people who bring, musical instruments to the fore.
We had somebody who did an entire story through interpretive dance. And this person, we got lucky enough, was a trained ballerina.
Mm-hmm.
It was beautiful to watch.
Yeah. So there's a lot of different ways you can approach this. You can be, a concert violinist. You can be, a street musician. You can be someone who has just picked up a guitar for the first time and has no skill at singing songs or telling stories. As with all of the auspices, you can be bad at the job. And so there's a lot of room to, express your character, express your role-playing abilities within this auspice. And I think that's really, really great about it.
So, one big key thing that I definitely want to touch on that does affect all auspices, but I have an example that can really emphasize my point when it relates to Galliard, is never, ever, ever pick an auspice because you feel obliged to do so out of character. So frequently as a storyteller, I will come across players who will come into the game late and see, oh, well, I really wanted to play a Ragabash or a Theurge or an Ahroun, and they can't, or at least they feel like they can't, because there's already one in the pack. Never feel this way. And I have an example with Galliard that emphasizes why you shouldn't feel this way. One of the greatest moments that I got to participate in as a player, and I got to hear stories about later, was there was a cairn building that was coming. And so myself and a bunch of other Galliards got together and sung this great song to emphasize that we are heading towards this glorious thing. And we spent weeks preparing for this. This was so much fun. We got together, we sorted and assembled music, we wrote lyrics, we put together little dance numbers. It was awesome. And the players were just so much fun to play off of, both in and out of character. And I could not have had that opportunity were there not other Galliards for me to play off of in that moment. You want to be a specific auspice? Be that auspice. Do not feel obliged to feel like you need to fill out a roster.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Getting that off my chest. Moving on.
All right. So last up, we have the Ahroun. And the Ahroun suffer from a serious problem of people considering them as you have to be a fighter, which you don't. The Ahrouns, remember we discussed, were sort of the military advisors. They're the ones who are most apt to take direct action, but this can come in a lot of different ways.
One of the best ways that I kind of heard it come out was actually in the Black Fury Tribe book, when they discussed how the Black Furies see the various different auspices, which is, they described Ragabash as Luna Cries, Theurge is Luna Ponders, Philodox is Luna Speaks. Oh no, what was it?
No, I think it's Luna Speaks.
Luna
Galliard
Speaks.
is Luna Laughs.
Luna Laughs. And Ahroun is Luna Acts.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, this can translate to I punch them in the face until they stop breathing. But, again, remember, with all of these auspices, you could suck at your auspice or take it in a different direction. One that I've commonly seen done to sort of break the mold is to be an Ahroun business person. Capitalism is very, very militant and aggressive, and so you can take it in this direction. Doing corporate takeovers of corrupt or worm-riddled corporations, things of that sort. Still taking direct action, it's still directly combating the worm, but it's not done with, a clave or a gun or a fist.
Mm-hmm. That's the big thing, too. And the mechanic that can help you kind of emphasize this notion of the difference between an Ahroun and, per se, a Ragabash is rage.
Mm-hmm.
An Ahroun has 5 rage. A Ragabash has 1 rage. And rage is that supernatural passion that you have. A lot of people tend to construe it as supernatural anger, and yes and no. I always tend to better emphasize it to players as supernatural passion, or supernatural righteous passion would be better.
Mm-hmm.
It can be self-righteous passion, absolutely. It doesn't have to be a good passion, and thus anger is a very common translation.
So Ahrouns have more starting rage than any other auspice. That means they are the most driven to act. One other thing I want to mention about them as we're talking about, combat and things of that sort, is Ahrouns are not necessarily idiots. Again, you're not only a soldier, but you are a military advisor. If there is a conflict that's going to start, the Ahroun is going to be a primary voice in determining if that fight is worth having, if there's one that's more important, and how to conduct that fight. So, again, if we're looking at this from, D&D perspectives, this isn't your dumb fighter or your idiot barbarian. These are people that can have very good mental faculties to sort of back all this up. There's a lot of different ways to approach the Ahroun. Don't feel hemmed in into being this idiot berserker or bruiser.
Mm-hmm. Now, that's not to say that you can't be that idiot berserker or bruiser, obviously. But that's kind of one of those things where one of the big things that we want to kind of counteract with this podcast is this notion of common traps that people fall into.
Mm-hmm. Or constraints, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So one of the big things with Ahroun that I would say is the biggest takeaway, we talked about in the last podcast with Hamid, how one of the things that you can do in order to make sure that you are playing an strong Hamid character is to have a cause. I would say that is doubly emphasized if you are playing an Ahroun. You need to play a character who is kind of maybe on an emotional hair trigger for specific causes, like the world is dying and people aren't doing anything about that. Be angry about that. Be more motivated to do certain things.
And I think a good way to sort of close all this out is to readdress what Amelin had mentioned about rage. Whereas, you really don't want to have a lot of constraints when you're thinking about your auspice. You can take as much or as little from it as you want. And again, this isn't a choice that your character made. This is sort of predetermined by Luna herself and the society you exist within. But your starting rage is something that you have to take into consideration when you're playing these characters.
Think of it as kind of like choosing an aspect of your personality in one sense. It's if breed is how your mind processes information, auspice is how you choose to react to that information.
Or how society expects you to react to that information.
That's a better way to think of it, yes.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And with that, I think we've effectively covered auspices.
Mm-hmm.
And then we can move on to tribes, which is going to be a much more in-depth concept. We're going to be talking about each individual tribe with these next podcasts so that we can really get into depth with them. And we're going to be starting with my favorite, Black Fury.
So see you next time for that discussion.